Welcome to this panel discussion on Britain and the Cold War Baltic, covering the period 1945 to 1988, which is hosted by the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. I want to thank the director of the Centre, Professor Brendan Sims, and his colleagues at the Centre for facilitating this event. This is the sixth in the Baltic Geopolitical Programme series. We've had a lot of interest, and I'm delighted to say that with our colleagues in the network of universities in the region, we're now building a substantial programme of events and activities and a regular newsletter. If you're watching this and you haven't yet done so, please sign up to receive our regular material. 114 people have registered for this event. It's an online video panel. We'll end in an hour at 1800, 6 p.m. UK time promptly. I will moderate a discussion with the panelists for the first half hour, and then in the second half, I will relay questions from the audience to them. You as the audience will be able to see and hear me and the panelists. You will have your microphone and camera switched off automatically, so that at no time will you be heard or seen by anyone in this webinar. However, you are still able to communicate with me and the panelists. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A option. Click on it, and when it opens, you have the chance to type questions. If you type questions, please start by writing your name and your affiliation first. If your question is for a specific panelist, please state that at the outset as well. I will try to cover as many of your questions as possible, although in view of these numbers, large attendance, and the time constraints, we might not be able to address everyone's questions in this session. Finally, I also want to let you know that this video panel is being recorded, and we will post the recording on our website over the next few days if you'd like to watch it then. So, as I said in the introduction, this panel is on Britain and the Cold War Baltic. And we've chosen the subject because the trauma of the Second World War in the Baltic was followed by the upheaval of its aftermath. Millions of people were expelled from lands annexed by Poland and the Soviet Union. In the Baltic states, nationalist partisans fought on for several years against the return of Soviet rule. Finland and Sweden armed themselves to the teeth in order to defend their sovereignty and their neutrality. In the Western Baltic, NATO became the guarantor of security. Britain played a less prominent role in the past, but still an important one. The British zone of occupation in Germany included her Baltic coastline, with the important cities of Lübeck and Kiel. The British Army of the Rhine was Britain's primary contribution towards NATO, and its area of operations spanned the Federal Republic of Germany's Baltic coast. Our panel will investigate how much this history has influenced current alignments and perceptions in the region in the UK. This evening, we're bringing together a distinguished panel of speakers to discuss these questions. I'll introduce them in detail for each of our sessions. Each will make a presentation of 5 to 7 minutes. Then after those three presentations, we'll move to the question and discussion that I mentioned earlier. Our panel is Thomas Wegener Fries. He's in Flensburg in Germany. He teaches at the University of Odense in southern Denmark. And extraordinarily, I've just discovered that right where he's sitting at the moment in Flensburg was a place for storage of nuclear warheads, highly relevant to our Cold War theme. Jacek Tybinka is in his flat in Gdansk. Gdansk celebrates its role in the history of the 20th century, as it's the place where the first shots of the Second World War were fired. And of course, with Solidarność and the strikes there, the steps towards the end of the Cold War were initiated in that country. And Inga Zaksaskina is now 20 kilometers from Vilnius, in a place which, though now in Lithuania, was actually in Poland before the war. So we've got the complex of the history illustrated in the locations of our three panelists this evening. You're all very welcome. The three subjects we're going to ask our panelists to introduce are firstly, the introduction to the Cold War in the Baltic after World War II. Secondly, British policy towards Poland and the Baltic states during the period. And thirdly, the British and Soviet ideological battle, both in Lithuania, but more widely in the region. So the first, the introduction to the Cold War in the Baltic. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Thomas Wegener Fries. He's the head of the Center for Cold War Studies and associate professor at the Department of History at the University of Southern Denmark in Odense. He works on a range of projects on different aspects of the Cold War. And Thomas, we're absolutely delighted to welcome you here to this panel this evening. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for having it here on the 5th of May, which is the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Denmark, which you can see behind me here. If I move my head, you can see Field Marshal Montgomery driving through the streets of Copenhagen right after the liberation, of course, making Britain the most political and economically influential power in the region for at least for quite some time, and also building a goodwill for Britain, which would actually last generation, and to some extent also been seen in the relative perspective, making also the history of the interwar period and the time before the war a little more rosy than it probably actually was. We could also have chosen to have our talk a few days ago. Then we would be commemorating British troops or Canadian troops actually coming to Wismar at the Baltic coast, where they met with the Soviet troops, which were just on the outskirts of Wismar, and thereby securing the Western Baltic Sea area for the West as a Western in the Western sphere of influence, and of course Britain being in the vicinity here in Schleswig-Holstein as a part of the British occupational zone, maybe though a bit reluctant, and we will probably come back to that later. The reluctant occupational power Britain here in our region, but of course a major shift in the power structure and the power balance at the time. Germany, for at least for a time period, not being a hostile power, not being a problem in the region, Britain playing for a little stronger role, and certainly the Soviet Union on the southern and eastern shores of the Baltic Sea being of course the major player in the after-war years. This is of course a huge topic, and to have it to make it easy for all of us, I would do like my forefathers and have it explained to me by a German officer. You can see him here in the picture. That's the former vice admiral of the Kriegsmarine from the Second World War, and after the war, the head of in the 50s, the head of the Defense Committee of the German Parliament, and the second ombudsman of the German Armed Forces. But in between, that's this period which is very formative for the structures in this area. He was also a very close friend to the Danish Foreign Intelligence Service, giving advice on who to put your money on in Germany, and also trying to explain and trying to share German knowledge, wartime knowledge, with his new one Danish friends, as with his new one American friends. Haie was a part of the historical division in Bremerhaven, and as you might see from this picture, of course, not an unproblematic person. This is actually from an East German propaganda magazine, 2 times higher, and still the same shark, which in German is a pawn. It's in English, it doesn't work that well. But a key figure in the rearmament of Germany, close confidant of Reinhard Gehlen, who after the war was head of the organization Gehlen, the American sponsored intelligence organization, and also the nucleus for the coming German army. Most of the people that we see later in key position in the German army are close to both the Americans and to Gehlen, and in these years also to their coming Scandinavian friends. Haie, one of the information Haie shared with the Danes, and we can see that on the next slide, would you change the slide, please? yes, here we see it, is from this is from a report or an analysis written in the historical division for the American about the role of the navies in the Baltic areas, drawing up a whole lot of possible scenarios for the Cold War period. I've just chosen the two extreme scenarios here on your right side, the scenario which we came to be dealing with for more than a generation, namely what happened if we would have a Soviet offensive, so the Soviet conquering the Baltic approaches, Schleswig-Holstein and Denmark, and thereby threatening the NATO supplies over the North Seas, but also, and that is what you can see on your left, probably the left, at least the one with the blue arrows. If the question is, what if NATO was able to at least for some time to stay in Denmark, stay in Schleswig-Holstein, the so-called bridgehead in highest highest terminology, it would give NATO, the Western powers, a quite good chance not only to strike deep into the Baltic Sea, into Poland, and into the Baltic republics, but also, if you look at Sweden in the middle, persuading Sweden to take a pro-Western stance, not to stay out of the war, as you would see in the prominent successful Soviet perspective. Let's change the only problem was if Schleswig-Holstein and Denmark was to be held, it needed military strength, and the region didn't have that. Schleswig-Holstein, which were the first place the Soviet troops would arrive, were kept in the early 50s by Danish and Norwegian troops supporting the British occupation and very small British detachment. Actually, when Norway in 1953 draw back their occupational troops, only about 2,500 Danish and British troops would have faced a Soviet invasion. We're making it more or less impossible to do anything about it. Can we have the next one, please? This goes very well together with the overall strategy of NATO in the region. You can see here, this is of course a picture of Germany, but Germany being the most important war theater in a possible war. That is also what eventually give the importance to the Western Baltic area. So please look up in the map at Schleswig-Holstein. Here you see in the early 50s, no chance the Danes and the Brits would have had would not have done anything about the Soviets. The Brits would have probably, if they were lucky, taking position behind the Rhine. But in the 60s, ladies and gentlemen, you will see the decisive change, namely the idea of maybe we would be able to hold for at least sometimes the game changer, of course, being West German rearmament. West Germany and Denmark were, for the rest of the Cold War, the close allies in NATO command Baltic approaches. West Germans chipping in with most of the most of the military power, and Denmark helping with command half of the time, and Britain in a more drawback position at Baltic staff, and of course as the immediate response forces in case of war. I think my time is up here, and we could of course continue this discussion.
Thomas, thank you very, very much. You've explained very clearly the military pressures in the situation, which I think, I think is probably forgotten a lot these days, the extent to which the military conflict was very sharp in people's minds. And you've described graphically how that's the case. And of course, also with the very important issues about the engagement of former pre-war German leaders in this situation, a very complicated introduction and complex. Thank you very much indeed, Thomas, for doing that. I'm now going to turn to Professor Jacek Tabinka to talk on British policy towards Poland and the Baltic states between 1945 and 1990. What was the role of Britain in this situation? Professor Tabinka is the head of the Department of History and Political Thought at the University of Gdansk, a Baltic port of great significance in the whole history of the region. He is an expert on British-Polish relations in the 20th century and the role of special forces in the history of the Cold War. Jacek, we very much look forward to hearing your introduction to this complex and interesting subject. Jacek Tabinka.
Thank you for introduction and for the invitation to this interesting, I hope, event. I will try to go briefly through the period of a couple of decades, we can say, starting with Churchill Iron Curtain speech in 1946, mentioning Stettin, Szczecin, and finishing with Margaret Thatcher visiting Gdańsk in 1988, a year before the end of Cold War for Poles, because for people in Baltic states, the perspective is, of course, different. At the beginning of 1948, before communist coup d'etat in Prague, the British Foreign Secretary Ernst Bevin came to that conclusion. He wrote in memo for the cabinet, it must be recognized that the Soviet government has formed a solid political and economic bloc behind a line running from Baltic along the Oder through Trieste to the Black Sea. And he didn't see any immediate prospect to change this situation. What is interesting and quite often from Western point of view missed, that Churchill and Bevin, they both talked about Iron Curtain along the line of Oder River, but in fact they forgot about Eastern Germany or Soviet zone of occupation in Germany, which was part of Soviet bloc. But we must remember that looking at British policy towards Soviet bloc during Cold War era, East Germany were treated as a part of German question. Well, we know when we can look at the map and we see that East Germany was at the Baltic coast, and of course, from military point of view, were very important. But when we are talking about building ideas how to develop British foreign policy towards Eastern Europe, East Germany were treated usually separately. Well, it changed in 70s after recognition, but still the perspective of future unification was more important than this Baltic aspect of being in this region. Well, in 1948, after Yugoslavian leader Tito was unmasked by Cominform as a traitor, British and Americans started to change the policy of containment, and we can find some elements of policy of liberation in the form of special operations, particularly in Albania, Operation Valuable, and well, sending agents to occupied by Soviet Union Baltic states, also to Poland, to what was called by Soviet Union Western Ukraine. But I think it will be the topic about which Inga will be talking. So I would like to say that well, British were never great fans, particularly Foreign Office of policy of liberation, which was encouraged to some extent by Eisenhower administration since 53. Frank Roberts, who was a very intelligent Foreign Office diplomat, noted in 53, if we are aimed at unseating the Soviet government in 5 years by means other than war, we were undertaking an impossible task. And he was right. So, so failure of special operations in Eastern Europe, particularly in Baltic states, also in Poland, change the perspective of policy towards Soviet bloc countries, and of course events in Poland and failure of Hungarian Revolution. Next slide, please. So a map of Poland, changes of border, and next slide with Władysław Gomułka. Gomułka rise to power in October 56, changed British policy towards Poland and Western policy. A policy emerged in London of support the national communist regime in Poland. So British focused on differentiation towards the rest of the communist bloc, showing Poland in the late 50s as a kind of example to the rest of Soviet bloc countries. Of course, they couldn't show this example to occupied Baltic states, which were republics of Soviet Union, although they didn't recognize British and Americans this occupation. I will not go into details. This is a very interesting legal question, recognition, de facto, de jure. Let's go back to British policy towards Poland and Soviet bloc. So in December 56, NATO ruled out the possibility of an uprising, of any support for any uprising in satellite countries. What is interesting, in 64, they changed the name used in documents from Soviet satellites countries to East European states or East European countries, stressing that, well, these countries are to some extent independent. Also, of course, it is a question of debate to which one, in which year, etc. Of course, in 60s, in 70s, and even in second half of 80s, it was difficult to predict the possibility of rapid disintegration of the communist bloc. In 70s, the town in East-West relations resulted in unexpected consequences for internal development in some Soviet bloc countries, particularly Poland, but also in Soviet Union. I mean, the final act of Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and particularly the third basket on human rights. British diplomacy was rather very careful at the beginning and didn't intervene too often when the question, when there were when there were information, press information, news information about Soviet Union, Soviet KGB arresting dissidents, but particularly since 77, since Carter presidency, London, Paris were more eager to act in Warsaw, in Prague, in Budapest, and particularly against Moscow. And of course, human rights were important factor in political warfare against Soviet bloc conducted by Western powers. 79, so time of change of government in UK. Margaret Thatcher, hostile to the idea of the town, but Thatcher was very pragmatic in her policy, so she didn't change much at the beginning in relations with Soviet bloc countries. Well, Western powers were very careful watching situation in Poland in 79, 80, so the beginning of crisis, then Solidarity Revolution. They were surprised by a wave of strikes in Baltic ports in Gdańsk, Gdynia, Szczecin, but there was a fear of provoking Kremlin by too open support for solidarity. In 1980-81, it's changed after introduction of martial law, so policy of sanction, but 84 normalization in relations with Poland, the visit by Malcolm Rifkind, the deputy foreign secretary, and he did a very important thing because he laid flowers at grave of Father Popiełuszko, Catholic Church killed by rough elements of security service, and he invited members of opposition, which was illegal from the point of view of communist government, for reception in embassy. And since 84, all Western leaders, except Mr. Papandreou, visited Popiełuszko grave and also invited for receptions members of opposition, something which was, of course, not done till that moment in the rest of Soviet bloc countries. Of course, not happening also in Soviet Union. Thatcher visited Poland. She was the first prime minister visiting Poland in '88. General Jaruzelski, the Polish communist leader, was angry at her because she wanted to go to Gdańsk and she wanted to meet with Lech Walesa. So when he talked to Politburo members, he commented, "Nasty woman, Anglicans hate puppies," but she starts the visit with Popiełuszko. But the visit went quite well. She encouraged both. I am finishing. I am finishing. She encouraged both leaders to talk, and next year we had roundtable meeting. And what is interesting, personally, Thatcher and Jaruzelski, it is a paradox, but they got to understand together quite well. Thank you.
Jacek, thank you very much for that. It's absolutely fascinating, and your slides were extremely interesting. Some of the issues you've talked about are discussed in a podcast which is released by the Centre for Geopolitics with Timothy Garton-Ash, which you may find interesting to look at. But I'm also interested, which I think is completely true, in a Q&A comment which comes from Graham Pendlebury responding to what you're saying. This level of ignorance in the UK about Baltic history astonishes me. Neither at school or university did we learn anything substantial about this large and complex era. And it's very interesting, and of course the reason why we've established these whole events, and your presentation, Jacek, drew that out very well. And now I'm delighted to welcome Professor Inga Zaksaus-Kiener to talk about the British and Soviet ideological battle, both in Lithuania, where she lives, but also more widely, which in fact is a very good follow-on from the points that Professor Tabinka has just raised, because this was a very intense question. Inga is the assistant professor at the Faculty of History at the University of Vilnius in Lithuania. And Inga, we're delighted that you can join us today. Thank you very much for coming. Inga. I think you're muted still, Inga.
Good. I'm sorry. Good evening. From my colleagues' talks, it's obvious that in 1945, the Soviet Union was already a wild card in international politics. The USSR became a military titan and political superpower, and it was obvious that different, not military measures had to be applied in order to deal with the new power, which was so important in the dividing world. The true battles of the Cold War between USSR and Western allies were fought on the ideological front, pitting democracy and capitalism against totalitarianism and communism. The Baltic area was very important geopolitically for both competing powers. Was it bridge or barrier? Was it Western gate to the east, or maybe vice versa? Maybe it was Soviet Union's gate to the Western countries. Let me stress a little bit the importance and the specifics of the Baltic area, Baltic republics, Baltic states, whatever we call it. And they were distinguishing different in the whole picture of the Soviet Union republics. First of all, these were countries forcibly incorporated into the USSR. And what's very important and was always used as an important fact in this ideological fight in the area, that these were largely non-Russian populations. The question of nationality and ethnicity remained crucial through the whole Cold War. These were the most nationalistically, the highest nationalistic moods in the whole Soviet Union in these republics. Not the less important fact is that the Baltic states enjoyed periods of independence and economic rise before the occupation, and this fact was still very vivid and alive in the memory of the populations of three Baltic states, and of course, again, very important fact in the ideological structure, ideological fight for hearts and minds of the populations of the Soviet republics. These countries undergone experience of massive repressions, deportation, and brutal collectivization process in all three Baltic states. And we should remember and mention the anti-Soviet resistance fights, the Partisan Wars, the Forest Brothers, as it's called in historiography, which in size sometimes is even compared with proportionally similar to that of Viet Cong in South Vietnam. And of course, these to repress the Soviet active resistant fights in the Baltic states was a big deal for the Soviet Union, and had to put a lot of efforts to suppress the partisan wars, guerrilla wars in the area. And generally, finishing the description of this different Baltic states area, the arena for further political warfare, we should keep in mind that this was the western frontier of the Soviet Union, and with very close proximity to Poland, which was, as just mentioned in my previous colleague's talk, was always a usual always a troublemaker for the Soviet Union. So all these facts show that Baltic states was the area where different measures, active measures of ideological, as we call it, political warfare had to be applied. So one of the major and the most systematical programs, political warfare programs, which Britain and the United States, which were the major actors in this area and in this field, implemented were, of course, radio broadcasts, Cold War radio broadcasts, enemy voices, hostile voices, as they were called in the Soviet Union, was the only source of alternative information for Baltic Republic's population. And as we see in reports about audience analysis, that's a very huge topic and not for today. So we see that the Baltic states, Baltic republics, were the major users and consumers of radio broadcasts. Although the United States had specific surrogate radios, which they established for this political warfare, to implement political warfare. It's Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, State Department's Voice of America, BBC. From the British side, BBC with Russian service was one of the most popular radio broadcasters in the area. And what's important to understand that although if Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty was always considered as black propaganda by Soviet authorities and was blocked, jammed the signal, radio signal, depending on the period of Cold War, sometimes extremely heavily, BBC Russian service was considered as white propaganda. That means that almost never jammed and freely audible in the area. News, political commentaries, music programs with Seva Novgorodtsev and other defectors from the Soviet Union stories, which were so used with, in these radio programs, because these vivid emotional stories told by people who managed to escape gray and hopeless life in the Soviet Union was extremely well heard and met in the Baltic states, with like undermining the Soviet propaganda of that miracle and beautiful Soviet life in the Soviet Union. So along with radio broadcast, which I repeat was major political warfare measure applied in the area by the United States and British propaganda, although I don't like that word propaganda, I call it making a message with a purpose. Also a so-called Cold War hot books program was also applied and implemented in the Baltic states. What does it mean? There was majorly the United States covert operation, but British anti-communist propaganda very tightly cooperated with the United States in this campaign of covert books program. The whole idea was to publish books of authors which are banned in the Soviet Union in national languages, Lithuanian, Russian, Latvian, Estonian, and smuggle them back to the Soviet Union. So the people in the Baltic republics reading, and of course in the Soviet Union, in Moscow, Leningrad, etc., reading these books and finding that banned material would question again, what's wrong with these books and authors? Why the Soviet authorities doesn't want me to read them? Major stories would be Pasternak, whose novel banned in the Soviet Union, Dr. Zhivago, but was secretly passed and photographed by MI6 secret surveillance agents and passed to CIA, who published it in small publishing house and then smuggled it back to the Soviet Union. And George Orwell also was one of these programs' heroes, whose Animal Farm also was published even in Latvian and smuggled back to Soviet Latvia. These are just a couple of cases to mention. We can go further with Solzhenitsyn's Archipelago, Gulago, Ginsburg's Journey to the Whirlwind, Nambokov's Lolita, and the huge list of banned books and authors in the Soviet Union, which via this secret books program found their way back to the Soviet Union. And the third aspect of this political warfare and the Baltic states, which was considered as a crucial arena for political warfare, I would like to remind about secret surveillance agencies and operations, which right after the Second World War were extremely active in the Baltic states area. Newly annexed Baltic states, valuable region for obtaining information about activities and objects of the Soviet Union, about military capacities. And of course, here in the Baltic states, the contact with the Soviet Union was more immediate, unlike in the Eastern Europe occupied by Red Army. So no surprise that both Western democracies used the region for better understanding of the Soviet Union's of its former allies' capacities. So here met free secret surveillances and free powers in the Baltic, free interests in the Baltic area. We had British intelligence collecting information, CIA collecting information. We had Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian partisans trying to get in any contact with these Western secret surveillance agencies. So just to gain any kind of political support from Western countries. And of course, Soviet intelligence, who managed to turn these intelligence programs to very successful counterintelligence programs in the Baltic states area. Of course, Soviet secret security played the major role here, and they're the major players due to the advantages they had at the moment. But we had a very interesting story, micro history story with which I will finish. my speech and leave more time for questions, then agents who were trained in the United Kingdom were sent to Lithuania. But at the beginning, just the moment they reached the Baltic Sea, seashore in Klaipėda, KGB agents, of course, already knew that with what mission they were coming. The mission was to hear the audibility of Voice of America and pass, of course, to CIA this information. And Soviet agents played a very beautiful, nice 1 month long game, blocking the signal, Voice of America radio signal in the adjacent apartment. At the end, the agents sent message to London that we cannot hear Voice of America. And going forward to even later years, the State Department in the United States, receiving this information, decided not to open Radio Free Europe broadcast to the Baltic states. So microhistory to show how important this area was, and big game was taking place here with very far-reaching results and decisions. So thank you.
Inga, thank you very much for that. You'll see some questions that have already been coming in this area. And delighted that's the case. Is my voice reverberating? Can you hear me all right?
Now, yes.
Now, yes, okay. Now, we've got a couple of questions coming in already, and I'm going to come to them and encourage everybody participating to contribute. I want to thank Inga for that presentation, but also Thomas and Jacek for excellent presentations. And what they've proved beyond almost anything else is the scale of what we've tried to tackle in this panel is really very substantial. So I'm going to kick off with a question from Professor Brendan Sims, the director of the centre, who says, how important was the UK to the defence of the Western Baltic by NATO during the Cold War? How much did countries like Denmark look to London, and what role did this play in entry to the European Economic Community in 1973? And I'm going to put this to Thomas first, and then I'll bring in other questions on the questions about the Soviet control of Poland and of the Baltic states. Thomas, what would you like to say about that question from Brendan?
Well, thank you very much for that. Actually, there's so many layers in this question. Britain played, of course, a large role in all of these aspects. I would say, particularly in the question of the road into the EEC. Because Denmark was I would say economically closer aligned with Britain than in the military sphere, and so Denmark spent like Britain more than 10 years in the European waiting room until being permitted in the early 70s, and see where that brought us now. But on the field of military, we see Britain in a much more reluctant position in the 50s due to the probably due to the inability simply to defend defend this area, and the willingness to invest both from British and from Danish side into a reliable defense of the Western Baltic. So the big player is, of course, Western Germany coming in, boosting the defense with almost 70–80% of the NATO troops there, and Britain, so to speak, being in the second and the third line. So the British troops would come in, but first as the first and the second reinforcements, and if time was long enough, Americans would follow, and of course, especially British. Especially the Royal Aircraft would play a substantial role in the first time of a possible conflict. So it's actually it's several layers, and in between here we of course have the intelligence cooperation, where there's a close, and there was a close tradition, but where there's also some mistones, like the Danish deputy chief of intelligence saying his German colleagues that he liked to cooperate with the Germans more than with the Brits and the Americans, because when you talk with the Americans and the Brits, it's often a one-way street when you deliver information.
Thank you for that, Thomas. I think it's worth recalling in this to the modern audience that when you talk about the countries bordering on the Baltic Sea, during the period we're talking about, the so-called Western NATO countries were really two: the Federal Republic of Germany, Western Germany, and Denmark, and the British Army on the Rhine in the FRG. The Soviet-controlled states were what we would now see as five: the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and East Germany, the GDR, and then neutrality, not NATO, not Soviet Union, from Finland and Sweden, two very important countries. So it's a far more complicated story of these countries around the Baltic than what we're used to today in any real sense. Now, we've had a couple of interesting questions following your presentation, Inge. One is from Torsti Putanen, who wants to complement your remarks by reminding about the Finnish television programs, which were visible in northern Estonia and that were an important window to alternative information for Estonians because of the similar languages of Estonia and Finland. I wonder if you could comment on that, but also Marina Burrell's point. What was the situation with local languages in conducting Soviet propaganda and in preserving Lithuanian and Estonian identities? You were talking about translations of some important books into the local languages, but could you talk about those 2 points, please, Inge?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's great questions. Regarding Finland and television, I could add on that the Poland television was, you could receive signal in some parts of Lithuania, and it had a huge impact on these parts of population, although it's like two small towns of Lithuania, but the people even now, when you talk to them, they say, I saw all Western movies. I knew the Marlon Brando and his movies, and I had absolutely different channel of alternative information. And of course, Estonia, when you look through the reports about the most popular sources of alternative information, they usually mention Finland and the constant different information. I wanted to stress that due to radio broadcasts, the Soviet Union lost the monopoly of information, which it was putting a lot of effort to hold in their hands. And the 50 years of Cold War brought to dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the new generation in the Baltic states with absolutely Western-like thinking, thinking that they need human rights, freedom of speech, free election, and etc. I'm not sure that I understood well the question about native languages, but the official politics in the Soviet Union was that Russification, the first language was always Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian. They were not forbidden. And even during the first years of Cold War, these populations did not speak in Russian languages. So that's why there was a huge demand of literature in the native language. And of course, due to very high nationalistic moods, they didn't want any material, anything that was in Russian language. That's why sometimes BBC Russian service broadcasts were criticized that why don't they broadcast in Lithuanian, in Latvian or Estonian? We do not like to be put in the same row with Russian languages. We are different republics. So national languages were not forbidden in Baltic states. Everything was fine.
Thank you very much, Inge. I'm now going to turn to Jacek. There's a particular question to you, which I'm going to ask, but I'm going to broaden it as well, Jacek. Pavel Jaworski has asked how much the British consular service was developed in the Baltic Sea area. Was it compatible with the British economic presence here? But I want to widen it a little bit because I was very struck in your presentation by your description of Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary's point, and Robert's point, the diplomat's point, about you couldn't do anything about the Soviet Union. And there was all the discussion about de jure, de facto, and so on. From that very strong position immediately after the Second World War, there were then a whole series of internal Soviet and communist tensions. including the Forest Brothers and guerrilla warfare in the Baltic states, which you mentioned, including deportations on the one hand versus Russification. Then you talked in your presentation about Gomulka, and possibly one could have talked about Gierek as well. And then, of course, Solidarność from 1980 onwards. And even in East Germany, you had the Berlin Uprising in 1953. So there were tensions within the zones controlled by the Soviet Union, which in a sense contradicted what Ernest Bevin and Roberts said, and of course ultimately led to the process of the wall coming down and the collapse of the Soviet system. How do you explain this contradiction between that 1945 to 48 view, you can't do anything, and the fact that not so much later, 40 years later, the Berlin Wall had collapsed, the system had broken down?
Oh well, both questions are very interesting. Yours, Charles, is well, not complicated, but it will take a while to answer. So I will start with a question about consulates, because it's an unknown story. After the Second World War, Great Britain wanted to see what is going in Poland. So what kind of elections, theoretically free according to Yalta Agreement, should be conducted in Poland? What was the presence of Red Army? So encouraged by, well, the communist government, although it was a coalition with former Prime Minister Mikołajczyk, they opened, well, 5 or 6 consulates around Poland, 2 in Baltic ports, 1 in Gdańsk. Well, they had, well, you had a consulate, general consulate in free state of Danzig, of Gdańsk, and another one, they called it vice consulate in Szczecin, in Stettin, although Great Britain didn't recognize de jure Szczecin as a part of Poland, recognized de facto, according to Potsdam Agreement. Both places were important because of, first, repatriation of Poles from Germany, then economic, so Britain was quite dependent on Poland in late 40s and early 50s during the hot Cold War, with import of food, sending to Poland machines, technology without paying hard currency to Poland. So it was, from British point of view, it was quite good trade. And of course, intelligence collections. For example, first vice consul in Szczecin, it was Joseph Walters. He was former member of Special Operation Executive. The same was in Gdańsk. Another member of SOE was in charge of consulate. Going back to your question, Charles, I didn't mean that Britain was powerless towards Soviet bloc countries. Foreign Office preferred political warfare. Well, during Stalinist era, economic embargo on many items was very painful for Soviet bloc countries, and this economic embargo was till the end of Cold War. Of course, in 60s, particularly in 70s, trade was much more open. But generally, Foreign Office, even in late 40s, early 50s, was very reluctant to ideas of liberation. So Operation Valuable was not, although Bevin agreed in Washington on conducting this operation, they were very reluctant about elements of policy of liberation. And since 56, rather a policy of differentiation, encouraging cultural contact, and trying to westernize communist countries. You can quite often find this word in basic memoranda, how to try to change the the communist countries. I saw one question about Operation Jungle and Poland. I think that we don't have time to answer, but it was more or less the similar situation like presented by Inga, operational game conducted by Polish security service under supervision of Soviet advisors, and it collapsed.
Thank you very much. Now, as you implied, we're getting quite close to the end. We've only got about 5 more minutes. So I'm going to look at the question on the other side, divisions and tensions within the Western side. Things like Finlandization, quotes unquote. What did people think like that? The ground-launched cruise missiles deployment, 1983 to 88. A lot of popular response on the West. Nuclear disarmament, CND, and so on. A lot of tensions also about the situation. I'm trying to work to understand, as Jacek has just described, what's happening on the eastern side, but also what's happening on the western side as the tensions emerge. And I'm going to tie into that a couple of the questions which have been asked. First is James Oates, where he says, in The Captive Mind, Milosz says that for Poles, the lesson of the Baltics would send one mad, he says, yet several Poles volunteered to work with British intelligence despite the failure of British operations. And you just mentioned Operation Jungle. How important was the Polish contribution? And then Graham Pendleby made the general remark I referred to earlier about the importance of studying this, but he then says, as a young lefty, he calls himself, visiting Warsaw in the 1980s, Father Popielski's grave was bewildering as the cemetery was full of Solidarność banners and photos of Margaret Thatcher. What did the British and wider European left make of all this? How did they understand it, the role of Margaret Thatcher compared to what was happening? And John Bickley raises a question about the importance of music and wonders what research has been done in this field. So I'm going to go around each of you now in the final minute or two from each of you, please, to try and respond to this point, and then we'll come to an end. I'm sorry it's so tight at the end. What this whole panel has demonstrated is the volume of what we're trying to deal with. But Thomas, would you like to kick off and comment on this general question of the tensions in the West, but then the particular points which have been raised?
Yes, of course, it always gets like this in the end. But I would tend to see the tensions in the West as actually the very strength of the West in the Cold War. Often this is depicted, especially the tensions in the 80s are depicted as a problem, but actually this is what made the West being able to look at the world with different eyes and able to do what what the communist regimes were not able to do, namely to develop and give people provide people a perspective for the good life, for good political life. So I wouldn't be so skeptical about the tensions, which was the life nerve in the West. I would, though, just point to the Operation Jungle, which has now been mentioned a couple of times. I think actually this is something which is definitely worthwhile being looked at now, because today we should have the ability to look at this from multiple sides, and I haven't seen a study being able to do that yet, but that is certainly something which should be done in the next couple of years.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Inga, would you like to answer these general points?
Yes, thank you. Great question. Music was that instrument, that tool who helped to reach for broadcasters and those ideological fathers of this fight, the young people, because political programs couldn't reach young people's minds and hearts. And music, especially good rock music programs, was that channel who reached their minds. And could introduce Western values. And as I mentioned, BBC Seva Novgorodtsev rock music program, which was phenomenally popular in the whole Soviet Union. And now more and more, just recently, a couple of years, new researches are coming up. And there's his whole page with all the playlists of Suzy Quattro, The Doors, Queen's newest playlist he wanted to suggest to the Soviet audiences. And of course, even today, everyone remember music programs of BBC and Radio Free Europe, but especially Seva Novgorodtsev BBC rock music programs.
Thank you very much, Inga. Jacek, I think you've got the last word here. So
thank you. Well, about music, Poland was rock and pop was our regime was very liberal. So well, we had Rolling Stones in Warsaw in 1967. So something what was unimaginable for the rest of the Soviet bloc countries. And there's quite big area of research in Poland, so we have a lot of publications about this Operation Jungle. The problem is that unfortunately Western archives materials are not opened. We have only documents on Operation Valuable in Washington and London, nothing about Operation towards Poland. About Thatcher, well, we must remember that she played quite positive role in supporting opposition in Poland. Inga mentioned the role of BBC, and of course all political warfare tools used against Soviet bloc were quite important. And I think that Poles liked her mostly in 80s because of critics from the Soviet Union, Iron Lady. So they didn't look at the situation in UK and her policy towards minor strike, etc.
Well, thank you all very much. As I say, sadly, we've come to the end of our time this evening. So this is the end of today's video panel on Britain and the Cold War Baltic. Again, I want to thank our three panelists for, I think you'd all agree, tremendously insightful contributions and responses to the discussion. My only apology to them is that we had so little time to explore some of the themes that were involved, but thank you to all three of you for making a tremendous event. I want to thank, as I said earlier, our colleagues at the Centre for Geopolitics who have made this possible and made the whole event happen. And I want to thank all of you who've come to participate in the audience of this event. I'd like to remind you that you'll soon be able to find a recording of this event on the Centre for Geopolitics website, and to urge you to sign up to receive regular information from the Baltic Geopolitics programme on future events, which are coming thick and fast at the moment. So thank you all very, very much indeed, and good evening.